be speaking about the process of issuing tokens in an ICO and also working with the American securities laws. In other words, the laws governing investments, governing the issuance of stocks and similar items. This is a very important topic. Well, let me check something. Who has done an ICO in this room? Raise your arm if you have. Congratulations. Anyone else? Have you done an ICO? Have you conducted one? Mm-hmm. Who here is thinking about conducting an ICO? I think everyone else is a liar. Right? Let me ask you a different question. Who here thinks that they have a technical or business idea that no one else in the world has yet to come up with? There's always one in every audience. You could be right. So let me explain some terms, and then we'll jump in. So there's this word in English I like. It's gambit. A gambit is a daring act that is calculated to gain an advantage. A gambit might be a very brave opening move in chess, for example. I would suggest that issuing your tokens in a way that works with American securities law is a very strong gambit and has many advantages for reasons I'll go into. There's this other term I'm going to be using a lot, and I'll sort of re-explain these. There's the U.S. Securities Act of 1933. That's the foundation of American law when it comes to issuing securities like stocks, bonds, and also tokens. The abbreviation for that, one that's commonly used, is SA 33. There's another core act that I'm not going to be speaking about during this talk, but you should be familiar with the name. It's the U.S. Securities Exchange Act of 34. And the main government body in the United States that regulates securities, that's going to be looking at tokens being issued with ICOs, is the U.S. Securities and Exchange Commission. And by the way, the proper way to say it is SEC. It's not SEC. So no one in the U.S. has SEC. It's always the SEC. So just FYI. Let's see if I can do this here. Here's a fast disclaimer. I am an attorney. I am a lawyer, but I'm not your lawyer yet. All right. Okay, this is a wall of text. It's a lot of words, but here's the essence. Just imagine we have a brave Ukrainian startup. And the short name is Gambit.io. And it's developing a breakthrough technology based on blockchain, crypto economics, vacations to Odessa, and decentralized apps. They don't have a white paper yet, but one that's coming soon. In order to accomplish their goals, develop an MVP and come to the market first, they need to raise at least $20 million. And that's a small amount given some of the other numbers that have been floating around here. So they need to raise that amount, $20 million, and they need to do it fast. And like every other blockchain startup, they're going to do an ICO. I mean, who wouldn't? So they need to raise 20 million, they need to move fast, they're going to do an ICO. But obviously, the world has changed. China has banned new ICOs, and other countries look as if they're poised to take action. So where do you get the money if you're doing your ICO? Well, the answer so far has not been the United States, because everyone is afraid of the laws there. They don't understand it, they feel fear, they avoid it. I'm going to suggest that it's time to take a fresh, knowledgeable look in a way that lets you accomplish your goals and not end up in jail. So that's Gambit, our brave Ukrainian startup. On a more macro level, on a bigger scale, just keep in mind that the two biggest economies in the world are China, actually the US still for now, and China. If you don't access capital in those two markets, one of which is just not available at all, you're cheating yourself out of, now, the biggest source of investment capital on the planet. If you avoid the US market out of fear of the security laws, another competitor who's coming up with their own ICO right after you may take that chance and get access to all those investment funds. So you're potentially leaving money on the table. Also, US investors are interested in investing in ICOs. They have the money. They're just looking at how to do it. And I know many of them, it's quite frustrating to go to a website and say, see that your IP is blocked, you can't buy. Some of them are actually learning how to use VPNs, but there's a lot of money being left behind. And of course, the reason everyone is avoiding the US is the laws are perceived as difficult, and the SEC, not the SEC, is perceived as mean. And there is some basis for this. The default rules under the United States security laws are tough. They are difficult to deal with, the default rules. And I'll drill in onto that. And the SEC can be very aggressive, especially if they feel like you're committing fraud and cheating innocent investors, some babushka with 1 kopeck to her name. So there's 4 ways in which startups have been handling this. Here's what we saw in the early days. People didn't know about this issue and they didn't care about this issue. They issued tokens and they let anyone buy it. They didn't care whether it was a security or utility, they just went for it. They raised their money. The feeling is that they would raise a lot of money quickly, get successful quickly, and then retire to Ibiza far away from the United States. That can work, or you can think about how clever you were from a US jail. I'd say at this point, the US government and the IRS and the SEC are aware of this phenomenon of ICOs, and this is not a good play. The second path that most startups are following is the extremely conservative route of just not selling into the United States. I would argue, again, that's not a good move, because at the very least, you're leaving money on the table for your competitor to go in there and get the capital. And so if that competitor, if you raise only 20 million because you can't do China and you avoid the United States, and a competitor who gets US investment money raises 100 million, even if you moved first, they're going to win. Here's another common approach that many startups are taking. They try extremely hard to characterize their token as a utility token. They have a vague idea why they're doing this, and I'll go into actual details. And they feel that if their token that they're selling in an ICO is a quote-unquote utility program token or protocol token, then somehow the US law doesn't apply to them and they're going to be okay. This is my vague attempt at writing a line of code. Obviously, I'm not a coder. But the general idea is that you're asserting that a utility token is not a security. You're praying. You're applying a random number to this. And if you are above magically a certain number, you survive. And if you're below, you got a problem. So that is sort of the default super safe route where you're leaving money on the table. And the fourth route is you know what you're doing. You get around the default rules in the United States, the tough rules. You find what's called an exemption. And you can raise capital from the United States safely and securely. Also, all those token holders from the US will use your product. If you're not selling your ICO tokens into the United States, you're leaving customers behind as well, not just investors. Okay, the way I like to put it is that the genesis block of US securities law is the Securities Act of 1933 that wiped out everything before it and started something new. So the genesis block, block 0 of United States securities law, is the Securities Act of 33. That was put into place after the Great Depression, or actually, I'm sorry, after the great stock market crash, and it was in response to the stock market crash of 1929. And there's a core rule in that genesis block, in that act, which controls everything else. And that is, if you're engaging in securities transactions in the United States, if you're selling something that's an investment or a security, the default rule is unless you make use of an exemption, again, that word, an exemption, if you're offering or selling securities into the United States, those securities need to be registered, and that's a key word, registered with the SEC. Now, if you're selling from Kiev via the internet, from the American point of view, you're selling or offering into the United States. It doesn't matter, you don't need to physically be there. And this default rule is tough, because if you do a full registration with the SEC under the default rule, you have to fill out a lot of forms, you have to pay a lot of money, and you have to create a very complex document called a prospectus. That's a key word again, a prospectus, which describes your investment offering in crazy detail. None of you want to do this. Okay, so a couple notes. That default rule, the default rule that you need to register your offering with the SEC in order to sell it, only applies to securities. Only. So if something's not a security and you're selling it into the US, at the very least, you don't need to register it with the SEC. So if you're selling pencils into the US, no SEC. If you're selling coffee cups into the US, no SEC. If you're selling oil or other commodities into the US, no SEC registration. That's why you get into the question of whether or not a token is or can be a security. Because it's a new thing. How do you know? We'll get into how you know in a moment. But if it is a security or may later become a security, which gets tricky, the default rule is you register it. Another note to keep in mind, and this actually makes the US a lot easier to deal with than people think, is that the SEC and the Securities Act of 33 does not care if an investment or security is good, if the babushka with the one kopeck should buy it. It only cares about whether or not the babushka has enough information for her or her advisors to make up their own minds. So they're not saying, you should really buy that stock, it's a good one, and therefore we're going to allow it. They're just saying, it's been described in enough detail that you can decide for yourself. So it's information, it's not advice. Obviously, you don't want to commit fraud, but as long as you're giving all the information, you're good. Now, there's obviously many investors in the United States with tons of money who have great advice who don't need the US government making sure that they have enough information. Okay? I'm going to suggest that this is the class of investor you want. If you're selling just to these investors and they are defined as, say, accredited or sophisticated, there are tons of exceptions or exemptions from the default rule. You do not need to register with the with the SEC. You do not need to draft a prospectus. You don't need to file all those forms. You don't need to pay all that money. If you sell to a certain class of people that do not need the protection of the Act, and I'll go into some details. And just to be clear, under some of those exceptions, you can raise unlimited funds. There's no cap. And under some of the other exceptions, there's a cap like 1 million or 5 million, but it's real money. And then I guess a final note on the Securities Act of 33 is that the SEC is not out to get you. Okay, it is part of their job, written into law, that they are to facilitate the formation of capital in order that businesses can get the funds that they need in which to grow and operate. They're not there to kill things. They're there to make sure it gets done right. But if you comply with the rules and the money is going to support new ventures, support new businesses, and keep the wheels of commerce going, you're helping the SEC do its job. Okay, I'm sure everyone has seen The Matrix. And I'm sure you can all remember when Neo was caught in the Matrix and then he woke up and he was in the desert of the real. So if you imagine that the securities law of 33 is the Matrix, how do you wake up from the Matrix? How do you get, like Neo, how do you get out of the Matrix? How do you make sure that the rules don't apply to you? Well, first of all, US securities laws only apply to you, if you're issuing a token or anything else, if it's actually a security. If it's not a security, then the rule by definition doesn't apply and they can't touch you under that law. What the heck is a security? Well, there's common securities that are actually named in that: stocks, bonds, indentures, things like that. Those are pretty easy. What happens if you get this kind of new thing, maybe call it a token, and you don't know whether it's a security or not? It doesn't have a stock label on it. It doesn't have a security label on it. What do you do? And what does the SEC do? Well, there's this other core idea of an investment contract, and that is written into the Act. Is what you're offering an investment contract? That is a catch-all or broad category that is meant to cover everything that is a security, but where they couldn't come up with a name. Or if something new that's developed that's a security, but it wasn't known at the time. So the real question is the token you're issuing an investment contract? Is it a contract for investment where you're going to get some sort of return? Selling a double latte, selling dollar bills, selling Bitcoin is not an investment contract. It's just regular commerce. So not everything that has value is an investment contract. Now, the crux, the basic case that decided what the heck this all is, what is an investment contract, and this is what you're all working with when you try to figure out whether or not something is a utility token, is the SEC versus Howey case, which came out in 1946, many, many years ago. And in SEC versus Howey, the Supreme Court of the United States, the main court, the court that tells every other branch of government what to do, came up with the test of whether or not a investment contract or a possible investment contract is one and will be a security. So really, when you have a token and you're issuing a token, you're applying what's known as the Howey test. That's what everyone is doing when they say that they have a utility token. I kind of joke around. I say utility token is some token issuer trying to dodge or trying to escape the characterization as a security under Howey. People try really, really, really hard to make sure Howey doesn't apply. And when they say utility, that means they've tried extra special hard. So there's 4 elements to the Howey test. Is there an investment of money or value? If someone just gives you something, there's no investment. Are you investing? Are you putting into the business or something money or value? No contribution, no security. By the way, each one of these needs to be true for it to be an investment contract or security. Is there what's called a common enterprise? That gets complicated, but it basically means several parties working together in an organized manner. It's not 5 people. Okay. It's not 5 people in the street who just happen to be doing the same thing. Are you doing it for profits? If you're donating to a charity, it's not an investment. And will your profits be derived from the efforts of others? If you're the one doing all the work, and you're putting in your money and your time, whatever's coming out as a result is not an investment contract. I like to say that a utility token is someone, Ukraine, Russia, Israel, wherever, trying to figure out what these 4 elements actually mean, trying to apply them to token design, and then praying that they're right for a long time. Now, I am a little extreme or edge of sarcastic when I talk about utility tokens, just because I've seen this abused so much. But the SEC has come straight out and said, if you truly have a token that does not qualify as a security under Howey, we're not going to regulate it. You're good. Okay, there is such a thing as a token that's not a security, that's truly utility. The core report that they came out with was in July 25th, and that was regarding the DAO. So as most of you recall, the DAO was a distributed autonomous organization. The way I explained it to non-technical lawyers, it was a sort of a digital corporation running on top of Ethereum, and it was meant to serve as an investment vehicle where people bought tokens in the DAO, they could vote on investments, and they would get a percentage of the return. The SEC applied Howey to the DAO and said, are the 4 elements satisfied? Yes, they are. These were securities. These should have been registered. So there's an example of a token that was a security. But they also said, unless this test proved all 4 elements were true, this wouldn't have been a security. And they threw in there that Ethereum is not a security. So we actually had the SEC coming straight out and saying some tokens, some cryptocurrency aren't securities. So if you look after this date, the explosion of the term utility token exploded on the internet because everyone saw this, read this, and tried to interpret what it meant. Okay, again, it's a wall of text. But suppose you want to issue a security that either is an investment contract, suppose you want to issue a token that either is an investment contract or might be an investment contract, or it helps your business model if it is a security. What if you want to issue something that's a security or you can't get away from it? What do you do? Right, you've applied the Howey test, and you know what? It is a security. And to take away whatever makes it a security would damage your business model. What do you do? That's when you find an exemption to the default rules of the 33 Act. And there's a ton of them. And each one has their own different requirements. Each one has its own little nuances. But the bottom line is they are much easier to comply with. They're much easier to deal with than a full registration. You can raise significant money, millions and millions of dollars, and do something less than a full registration with the SEC. And so one commonly used group of exemptions is at the bottom here. It's Regulation D. Usually you're here to refer to as Reg D. And in Reg D, there's my 3 favorite exemptions. They're referred to as rules. You have SEC Rule 504, 505, and 506. 504 is referred to as seed capital or startup capital. It is the easiest to deal with. It's actually extremely easy to deal with. And you can raise up to $1 million in the United States without doing a full registration if you comply with the rules under 504. 505 lets you raise up to $5 million in the United States without having to deal with the full registration. And 506 can let you raise unlimited funds in the United States without doing a full registration. So that whole thing about with your IP blocking investors or not having people from the US buy your tokens can go away. You can sell directly into the US and raise that money. When you have an offering of securities to US investors under each one of these exceptions, that's not a public offering as if you were doing a full registration. It's called a private placement. That's the term, a private placement. And when you're doing a private placement, you do not need to write this full prospectus. Again, remember, a prospectus is a long, crazy document describing your investment. You file with the SEC, and by the way, it's public. You don't need to do that. You do something called, actually I jumped ahead, you do something called a private placement memorandum, or PPM. It generally describes the investment. It doesn't need to dot every I, cross every T, and put in every little detail, because the idea is you're selling to people who know what they're doing. And they know enough to ask questions, and their accountants and advisors know enough to ask questions. And again, that class of investors that let you take advantage of these exceptions are variously referred to as accredited or sophisticated. And to decide if they are, it's not guesswork. You don't have to ask them, hey, are you smart? Do you understand investments? Do you understand investment law? Am I safe? You don't have to ask. There's an objective standard. It's whether or not they have a certain level of income. It's whether or not they have a certain net worth, i.e., if you take all of their assets, what they own, and you subtract all their debts, what's left? If they have over a certain amount, you're good. Or, even if they're fools, if their lawyer or accountant can advise them so that they're not that foolish, then they can be an accredited investor. So if you limit your buyers to this class, you can find an exemption under the SEC rules. You give them PPM, you get the money, and you're good to go. And each one of these exemptions has obviously its own little nuances. There's a reason it's in different rules. But you can deal with it. OK, so I'm pausing.